Hi, I'm Thomas. Thanks for joining us for this presentation of the stress metric that we have created with Neurons Inc. What I'm going to present here today is an article, a piece of work that we have done together with the University of Southern Denmark and with support from the Value Foundation here in Denmark. And the stress metric is something that we have just presented at the Human-Computer Interaction International Conference in Copenhagen. Well, it was not a physical conference this year, but it is an annual event. And this year it was, due to the corona crisis, it was of course online. So in this presentation, I will go through some of the work that we have done in creating the stress metric. When we look at stress, and especially when we look at workplace stress, this is one of the really big challenges that we have today. The response that people may have when presented with work demands and pressures that are not matched by their knowledge and abilities and which challenge their ability to cope. That is the definition that the World Health Organization is using to define workplace stress. So it's all about whether we are able to cope with the pressures that we have, and then whether we feel that it kind of exceeds our ability to deal with those challenges or not. And when we look into stress and work-related stress, we know that stress is abundant around the world. A recent British survey found that 74% of the population felt that they had experienced stress to a large amount over the last year. That means that they have felt overwhelmed and unable to cope. When we look at the stress cost, we know that in the Western world, the estimate is almost $200 billion annually that we see that there's a cost related to work-related stress. And finally, that it's actually the production that is the main cost effect here. So contrary to what you might think, is that it's not so much the healthcare and medical costs that are related to stress here, but it's actually the loss of production that is the main driver of the cost related to work-related stress. So of course, stress is something we really want to avoid, but the first step is then to try to understand why stress happens in the first place, and then of course also what can we do about it, and can we detect it as a first instance. And when we started looking into this work, we found that there were certain types of effects, certain types of findings that seem to pop up consistently. And these four are just representations of that. So Lewis and colleagues found that stress was related to increased right-sided frontal brain dominance as measured by the frontal alpha EEG data. We found that CEO and Lee, they reported an increase in the summation of frontal activity in the beta range when people experience stress. Mingulon and colleagues found that the stress was related to increase in the relative frontal engagement in the gamma frequency. And then finally, not looking at the EEG, but more into heart rate variability, they found that stress was related to increased heart rate variability. So the aim of this study was twofold. On the one side, we wanted to test whether we could advance these findings to use machine learning combined with neuroscience and biometric data to create a better stress metric. And the second was to test whether those measures could also be used in real-life settings. So that means out of the lab setting. And this is something that could be scaled so people can wear it, basically. Our approach was to basically was twofold. On the one side, we wanted to test the existing hypotheses. So one thing is that you can find a significant relationship between stress and certain types of brain pattern, as we saw on the previous slide. But we also wanted to evaluate whether that metric could be turned around into a predictive measure. The second approach was to use what we can call exploratory methods. So we used things such as the lasso methods, the LARS methods, the PLS method, and then finally we used different types of machine learning approaches using the TensorFlow framework. And this was more in terms of using an exploratory approach that allowed us to dive into the data and basically use the raw data to see if we can come up with an even better predictive score rather than a theory-driven approach. In the study, we controlled the levels of stress that people had. We recruited 63 participants, and we used two different types of EEG measures. One EEG measure was the ABM-X10, and the second was the Muse headband. We also recorded the heart rate variability by first recording the heart rate and then calculating the heart rate variability from the heart rate. And then people went through a pseudo-randomized design with 3 levels of demand. So they could have 1 task, 2 tasks, or 3 simultaneous tasks that they were asked to do at the same time. And the first task would be to watch a documentary. The second would be to watch the documentary and do another task, so working memory task. And the third would be to do those 2 tasks and the third task on top of that. And we also asked people whether they felt a level of stress afterwards. And only the trials and only the people that experienced stress would be included in the tests. And all of the people of the 63 we tested reported feeling stress during those high level or high demand situations. When we started analyzing the results, we focused on trying to test whether the results of previous researchers could be confirmed. So as we mentioned before, there were 4 different findings that we looked at. And yes, indeed, we can confirm that stress was related to changes in the frontal brain asymmetry in the alpha band and the frontal beta increase, the increase in frontal relative gamma, and finally increased heart rate variability. So that basically confirmed statistically what other people had found. However, when we try to turn this around and look at whether those metrics could be predictive of stress, which is a totally different question, they turned out not to be performing as well, except for heart rate variability. And the interesting thing here was that for all the EEG measures, so the frontal brain asymmetry in alpha, frontal beta increase, and frontal relative gamma increase, we saw that the predictive power of that was about 57%. While on the other side, if we looked at heart rate variability, that actually achieved almost 80% predictive ability. So that was pretty interesting to show that, this shows basically that when researchers are finding significant results, it's not necessarily so that you can just turn this around and make it into a metric and then there you go, you have a strong metric for a certain thing. You have to do your due diligence and try to test this and set this up as a predictive metric test as well. The second was then to look at how we could use machine learning to see if we can produce a more predictive value, a more predictive stress metric, if you like. And here we found that for both the machine learning and the different other exploratory results, they performed much better looking at the raw data, and we found certain models that were more predictive or created better metrics for each of the different devices we used. So when we looked at the ABM-X10, the TensorFlow machine learning approach produced an 82% accurate predictive model. And when we looked at the Muse, the lasso analysis method produced a score that was almost 75% accurate. And then this compared to the heart rate variability that showed that it's almost 80% accurate as well. So this means that by using machine learning models and exploratory models, it's possible to create much more creative or much more predictive metrics of stress using those methods and using even a low level EEG device such as the Muse headband. And as I mentioned before, this has now been published and presented at the HCI International 2020. It also comes out through this link, now published in the International Conference on HCI, and it's called Augmented Cognition, Theoretical and Technological Approaches. So I'll provide a link here on this slide, but also in the show notes as well. Now, beyond this approach, we also have looked into, the feasibility of using the lightweight metric for measuring stress along the way. And just as kind of a early step analysis, we see that in a regular office setting, it's possible to use these devices without losing too much data. And of course, the combination of the heart rate variability and the Muse headband then in combination can produce a much more predictive score, because then you can have two sources to the same effect, basically. So here you see on the top graph, you see the Muse headband, and on the bottom graph, you see the heart rate variability score over time. And these are just raw data that we are plotting just to see, whether we are losing any data. And, as you can see, for these 4 people, at least, there's no loss in data for either of them, maybe just a few places. But this demonstrates that it's feasible to go outside the kind of a highly controlled lab setting and use this in more a less intrusive setting. So that means that you don't have to wear a high resolution EEG headband on or EEG device on, but this is something you can actually wear even with devices such as the Apple Watch, for example. So this demonstrates that the stress metric we have come up with is highly reliable when it comes to using machine learning to come up with a predictive score. And this means that when we are running studies at Neurons, it's possible to include the stress metric and measure whether people are feeling stress at certain points. It also means that the next step for us is then to look at other devices for how we can use stress and a stress metric with much more mobile devices, such as the wristband, for example, or the Muse headband, for example, just to make sure that people are not feeling that they are being wearing some intrusive devices as well. So yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that.